So the title that I gave to my comments today is Ivan Turgenev, Russian Turmoil and Russian Nature. Um, and I did that because there was always turmoil in Russia. There always has been, there is now. Um, and Turgenev never really turned away from that. Conflict, struggle, violence are always there in his work at some level. But at the same time, he was also deeply fascinated by the beautiful natural beauty of Russia. And so we're going to explore both of those themes as we go along here. Before we get too far, I wanted to jump in by throwing some of Turgenev's language at you. And this first excerpt, I hope you can read it on your screens, is a translation of a very short poem in prose that he wrote about a year before he died. So this is very late in his life. And this is a very famous miniature. The entire text of this little essay is on your screen. In these days of doubts, he wrote, days of painful reflections on the destiny of my homeland, you alone are a support and buttress to me, O great, powerful, truthful, and free Russian language. If not for you, how could one keep from falling into despair in view of all that's happening at home? But one cannot believe that such a language was not given to a great people. So Turgenev here, as you can see, is someone who cannot resist loving his native Russian culture. At the same time, he's very clear-eyed about the problems of Russia. And in this case, he has in mind numerous political problems that were going on back in Russia while he was abroad. A statement like this could be written today, certainly, by Russians who are outside of Russia looking at what's going on, for example, at the obscene war that's being waged against the Ukrainian people by the Putin regime. You may, if you speak Russian, you might even already know this statement from Turgenev, which is quite famous. Because it contains the phrase "Великий могучий русский язык," the great powerful Russian language, and people use that as sort of a nickname for Russian these days. So there's one excerpt. Let me throw this one at you too. This is something that Turgenev said to Tolstoy in 1857. He wrote this in a letter. He said, "Systems are prized only by those to whom the whole truth is not given, who want to catch truth by the tail. A system is exactly like the truth's tail, but the truth is like a lizard. It will leave the tail in your hand, and the lizard will run away. It knows that it will soon grow another." Now, I love this metaphor of Turgenev's, and I wanted you to enjoy it just because of the loveliness of the figure of speech, but also to think of it as a warning to myself and also to all of you that if I seem to be presenting today a particular truth, a particular way of interpreting Turgenev, and this is the right way, I am misleading you. Turgenev is not that kind of writer. He is not one of these writers who is easily summarizable. There are many truths about what he did and how he achieved the literary results that he achieved, the great artistry that he accomplished. So we need to bear in mind that I'm going to be looking at one facet by and large today, and that is his nature writing. And I also I'm not advertising my books here, but just recently published a book, as Michael said, called Hunting Nature. It just recently came out in a sort of slightly corrected and improved Russian translation that I helped work on. So if you're interested in what we talk about today, by all means, take a look. You can find a lot more detail in these books. But here's Turgenev. This is Perov's famous portrait from 1872. And this is sort of the classic view of Ivan Turgenev. I mean, he looks like a famous writer. He's got white hair. He's got the sweeping white beard. He's holding a closed book in his hand, and he's got his pince-nez, his eyeglasses in his other hand. He seems to be lost in thought, kind of gazing off to the left there. And this is sort of the canonical view of Turgenev. This is Turgenev, the philosophical novelist, Turgenev, the novelist who is concerned with unhappy love, and perhaps most famously with ideology in 19th century Russia, the struggle specifically between conservatives and liberals. But there's another Turgenev pictured here in this painting. This is painted close to the end of Turgenev's life in 1880. And this is by Dmitriev Orenburgsky, and it's a study for actually a larger canvas, but this shows Turgenev engaged in the most unquenchable passion of his life, as Michael mentioned in the introduction, and that is hunting. So there he is with his shotgun. His eyeglasses are in place this time. There are no books to be found, and he's got his finger poised over the triggers of this double-barreled shotgun. And he looks a lot more interested than he did when he was sort of sleepily gazing away in the Pirov portrait. So of the two Turgenevs, this is the one that I really want to focus on with you today. Here's another image of Turgenev that's quite famous. This is the most famous photograph that was taken of him. Here he is with a group of Russian writers of his generation, more or less, who wrote for the famous literary journal called The Contemporary, Современник in Russian. If you want to find the most famous one besides Turgenev, who's seated second from the left, you would be looking for Tolstoy. So Tolstoy, who is standing right above Turgenev, the one in the military uniform. Now, Turgenev grew up in this estate. He was born in 1818, and his mother was a woman named Varvara Lutavinova. His father, Sergei Turgenev, was younger than Turgenev's mother. Turgenev's mother had a terribly unhappy life. She is infamous in biographies of Turgenev. She had been terribly abused sexually and emotionally as a girl, and had sort of gone through hell in her early adulthood. And finally, she married this man, this officer named Sergei Turgenev, who was transparently, openly not marrying her for love. He was marrying her for her money. This was not uncommon in those days. And Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev was the result of this marriage, born in 1818. Now, this estate eventually came into the hands of Turgenev's mother. Turgenev's father died when Turgenev was a teenager, and this estate, which is called Spasskaya Lutavinova, is about 200 miles south of Moscow. And these are photos I took there, about 20 years ago now. But that's the chapel on the estate. These are some of the some views of the countryside right around the middle of the estate. This is the manor house as it looked about 20 years ago. The Russians were rebuilding it as part of this sort of dom usadba for Turgenev. It is crisscrossed, this estate, by beautiful walkways that are laid out very carefully with towering linden trees all around them. You can see one of those linden avenues. And here is a lovely sort of map, a bird's eye view of the estate, which I'm showing you because it gives you a sense of how carefully laid out Turgenev's childhood home was, and how symbolically laid out it was. So it was built in the very first few years of the 1800s by Turgenev's great uncle, that is to say his mother's uncle Lutavinov, and it was the beginning of the 19th century, and so actually embedded in the layout of these linden avenues that I mentioned, these long straight walkways, they actually embedded the number 19. I don't know if you can see it, how well you can see this image on your screens, but it's the Roman numeral XIX right there. So Turgenev grew up on this beautiful country estate, and he enjoyed from a very early age, probably from the time he was about 10 years old, heading out into the woods with the peasants who belonged to the family and hunting. At the same time he was enjoying the natural beauty of the estate, he was witnessing terrible cruelty. There are many famous stories about how, especially his mother, mistreated the serfs who lived on the estate. And allegedly, according to biographers, this instilled in Turgenev a deep hatred of the institution of serfdom, which was its own form of slavery in Russia at the time. So eventually Turgenev grows up. He heads off to Moscow University in the 1830s, transfers after a year to St. Petersburg University. Then when he's finished with his bachelor's degree, he then goes to graduate school in Germany, comes back in the early 1840s, an extremely accomplished Russian intellectual of tender years. And he is already by that time fluent completely in French, German, obviously Russian. He's also good at English, and he eventually speaks Italian as well. And in the early 1840s, the other most important passion of his life, he had already established hunting as something of key importance to himself. The other most important passion had established itself. This is his relationship, infamous relationship with the famous French mezzo-soprano who was one of the great divas of her day, Pauline Viardot. He met her in Petersburg in 1843 when she needed to have translated into Russian some of the Russian songs that she was going to sing for Russian audiences while she was on tour there. Turgenev at the time was a poet. He was not a prose writer in those days, but he was sort of an amateur poet, and he was introduced to Pauline. He fell deeply in love with her. And after 1843, for the next 40 years, and I'm not exaggerating, he followed her all over Europe, all over Russia, and essentially became a member of her household. He was also best friends with her husband, Louis Viardot, who was considerably older than both Ivan Turgenev and Pauline. And Louis Viardot was actually a fellow hunter. And so they shared their love of hunting together and frequently hunted together. Eventually, Turgenev lived on the Viardot estate outside Paris at the end of his life and even died there in France. And biographers debate endlessly what the exact nature of the relationship was between Turgenev and Pauline, but I will leave that for another time. Now, the importance of hunting in Turgenev's ability to describe the natural world is really impossible to exaggerate. Here's a quotation from a German hunting partner of Turgenev's named Julian Schmidt, who said, "Everywhere Turgenev took notice of artistic images, but it was the forest that provided him his richest material, the forest that he, as a passionate hunter, studied in all its types. He studied the natural beauty of his homeland, not as an idle passerby, but as a hunter." One of the things I try to argue in my book is that Turgenev believed in something called venatic equipoise, and that's just a fancy phrase that means a hunterly sense of balance. So, in other words, I argue that Turgenev looked at the natural world and saw the natural world in great detail and with great sympathy because he was a hunter and he was outside all the time, roughly 2 months of the year for his entire adult life hunting. And what he saw there and what he believed in was something that is a form of balance that for Turgenev meant both equipoise, but also indifference. So in Russian, there are two closely related words. There is ravnovesие, which means balance or equipoise, and then there's равнодушие, which means indifference, lack of interest in something, not caring about something. And for Turgenev, in multiple writings, he links those two things in the natural world. So in other words, there's a kind of inherent turmoil, this very important category for Turgenev, between the hunter or the observer's delight in the beauty of nature. And then from the point of view of the observer, nature is indifferent to that observer. Nature doesn't care about the creatures who constitute the natural world. He wrote about this a lot. I want to give you a couple of examples. See if I can. Oh, now I've lost the ability to advance my. Oh, here we go. Okay. Um, Here's probably his most famous philosophical statement about nature. He said, "She constitutes one great, well-proportioned whole. Every point within nature is united with every other point. But at the same time, her aspiration is that precisely each point, each separate unit within her, exist exclusively for itself, consider itself the center of the universe, turn to its own advantage, everything around it, negate the independence of those surroundings, and take possession of them as its own property. So to the mosquito who sucks your blood, you are food, and he makes use of you just as calmly and without shame as the spider into whose net he has toppled does him, just as a root that digs in the dark makes use of the earth's moisture." Now, one of the most beautiful statements of what I am calling venetic equipoise, which is this category that not only sums up the way hunters are able to view and appreciate the natural world, but also represents an ideal toward which hunters who write should aspire in their literature. In other words, the author should also emulate nature in creating this form of Olympian and beautiful balance. He provides a beautiful description of this balance in this story called Поездка в Полесье, which is, I translate as Journey to the Forest Belt, which he worked on in the 1850s. And this is it's a very simple story in a way. It's about a hunting trip into an ancient primeval forest, parts of which have been burned, and it's a great place to hunt for black grouse. And the hunter narrator becomes very depressed during this trip among these ancient trees because he sees his own insignificance compared to these ancient trees that sort of tower over the hunting trip. And he becomes depressed about this on the first day. And then on the second day, he feels better with the help of one of his peasant guides as he's hunting. And then very close to the end of the story, there's a moment when the hunter has finished hunting for the day on the second day, and he reposes at the edge of the woods. And this is what we read. "I raised my head and saw on the very end of a slender branch one of those large flies with an emerald head, long body, and 4 transparent wings, which the coquettish French call damsels, right? Demoiselles, while our unsophisticated folk have nicknamed them Karamwisla." And I'm going to come back to that word in a minute. "For a long time, more than an hour, I did not take my eyes off her. Baked through by the sun, she did not move, but only turned her head occasionally from side to side and stirred her upraised wings. That was all. As I looked at her, it suddenly seemed to me that I understood the life of nature, understood her undeniable and manifest, though for many secret meaning, quiet and slow animation, deliberateness, restraint of sensations and forces, equilibrium of health in each separate being. This is her very foundation, her immutable law. This is what she stands upon and is supported by." So the reason I have those 3 images at the left is to illustrate this very interesting word, karamwisla, that Turgenev uses to describe the species of fly that he's talking about. Now, one sort of plain entomological sense of this word karamwisla is simply a species of large dragonfly called Ishna viridis that's very common in Russia, especially around the forest belt. And the female has a large bright green head, as you can see in that photo at the top. And so clearly he means the word karamwisla to mean this particular green dragonfly. But the dragonfly is actually named after something else. Karamwisla is a very well-known and very ancient tool used by peasants to carry 2 buckets of water. And I'm showing you an excerpt from a painting, also on the left, the second image from the top, that shows you what we're talking about. This is a shoulder pole or a shoulder yoke that was used by women to gather water from the well or from the river or from the pond and to bring it into the house where it would be boiled and then used in cooking and tea making and washing and so on. So karamwisla has that meaning. There's a third meaning that karamwisla has, which is the meaning represented at the bottom of those images to the left, and that is the balance beam of a traditional scale. So you can see the two pans being suspended at either ends of that balance beam. So the karamwisla is that horizontal piece in the middle that tilts depending on the weight of what's in the pans. So in a really beautiful way, if you're interested in the sort of richness of Turgenev's vocabulary, he specifically uses to symbolize this venetic equipoise a particular insect whose particular name also embeds these other crucial notions of balance that he holds to be so important in the natural world. And, lest you think that I'm reading all of this into this word karamwisla, there are plenty of other dragonflies with very colorful names in Russian, like babki and detki and dozorshiki and richniki and all kinds of things that he could have used, but he specifically chose karamwisla, and I think he did it deliberately. Now, this beautiful sense of repose is always underlain in Turgenev's writing by a sense of struggle, as I mentioned before, the turmoil that I was talking about. Here's an excerpt from an 1868 letter to his beloved Pauline Viardot. He writes, "Having seated myself on a bench, I involuntarily thought of you, flooded with the purest light, filled with fragrance, beauty, and evident serenity. The land around me was a true field of carnage. Everything furiously, violently devoured everything else. I saved the life of one small ant who, despite desperate opposition, was dragged and rolled along the sand, turning tiger-like somersaults by a large ant. No sooner had I saved the little one than he seized with the same ferocity a little half-dead fly. This time I didn't interfere. Destroy or be destroyed. There's no alternative, so we'll destroy." Now, this is reminiscent of the kind of conflict that Turgenev describes in another of his famous late poems in prose. This one is from 1879. It's very short. It's a page long. And here's an excerpt from it. And it's a very simple little story. It's a story of the narrator having a dream. And in this dream, he sees a green-clad goddess. And he knows immediately that this goddess is nature herself. And he says, "Oh, nature, what are you thinking about?" And here's what she says to him. She says, "I am pondering how to impart greater strength to the leg muscles of the flea that it might more easily save itself from its enemies. Equilibrium of attack and defense has been disturbed. It must be restored. I know neither good nor evil. I gave you life, and I'll take it away and give it to others, both worms and people. To me, it is all the same." Now, if you've read much Turgenev, you know this attitude of giving life to characters, killing off characters in his fiction is something that is all over the place. And in this sense, we can argue that he is emulating this nature goddess here, this nature goddess who is neither good nor evil, who doesn't care about human justice, but who simply wants everything to be in balance. That's what she wants. Now, there was a tremendous social imbalance, of course, in Turgenev's day, and that imbalance was serfdom. So in order to sort of understand this, I just quickly wanted to give you a few numbers. Just to remind you that by mid-century, about 85% of the population were peasants, and about half of those peasants were enserfed. That is to say, they were essentially slaves. They belonged to other human beings, to about 5 or 10% of the population who owned 30 million people. Nicholas I disapproved of serfdom, but he was too afraid to do anything about it. It was his son, Alexander II, who finally abolished serfdom in early 1861. And that's about almost 2 years before Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States to abolish slavery in this country. So serfdom was a fact of life, and it was a disgusting fact of life. Intellectuals of pretty much all political stripes disapproved of it, but it was extremely difficult to root out until Alexander II finally pulled it off in the early 1860s. How did Turgenev feel about it? Well, here's a famous quotation from his memoirs in which he says, the social stratum to which I belonged, the landowning and serf-owning stratum of society, did not represent anything that could hold me back. On the contrary, almost everything I saw around me aroused in me a feeling of embarrassment and indignation, and finally, disgust. I could not breathe the same air as those who stood for the things I hated so much. I could not remain at their side. I had to put a certain distance between myself and my enemy so as to be able to attack him more effectively from the distance that separated us. In my eyes, this enemy had a clearly defined form and bore a well-known name, and this enemy was serfdom. Under this name, I gathered and concentrated everything against which I had made up my mind to fight to the very end, which I had sworn never to be reconciled to. So I love this image of Turgenev. It's not one you see very often, but it's a daguerreotype that comes from the exact period that he's describing, conducting this battle against the institution of serfdom in the late 1840s. And he talks about putting distance between himself and serfdom in order to attack it. And what he's referring to there is the fact that in his writings, which we'll talk about in a second, from the late 1840s, he was almost constantly abroad in Western Europe, looking back at Russia, writing stories about Russia from the distance of Western Europe. Before we get to that, there are a couple things I need to tell you about his hunting. So we have a sense of this special view of the natural world that Turgenev believed hunters have. I just need to point out that when we say hunting, and I'm not a hunter myself, but I used to think, oh, well, of course we know what hunting is. It's running out into the woods and shooting things. Well, it's not quite that simple. In Turgenev's day, there were three very different types of hunting. The first kind, the most ancient kind, is shown in this painting, and it's called coursing, usually in English. In Russian, it's psovaya охота, and it refers to chasing down hares, but usually foxes, and most famously in Russia, wolves, using very fast, silent hounds called borzois or barzia sabaki, swift dogs. And then once the dogs corner it, the hunters can ride up and they can kill the animal or trap it, whatever they want to do. There's a second kind of closely related hunting called hounding. In Russian, this usually goes by the name of ганьба. And you can see a picture of it here as well by the same artist, Kivshenko. And this too is a sort of massive epic undertaking, just like coursing. It's noisy, and here you're not using fast gaze hounds like borzois or greyhounds or anything like that. Instead, you're using scent hounds who are very noisy, very slow, but once they get on a scent, they never give up, and the whole pack follows the wolf or follows the fox or follows the hare. And then the hunters, once again, on horseback, try to catch up. Now, what's really important to keep in mind is that both hounding and coursing are forms of hunting that were extremely large scale. They required kennels. They required many peasants on the staff to take care of the dogs, to train the dogs, to control the dogs during the hunt. So it was a rich man's sport. It was a sport that nobles could engage in. It depended on serfdom. And it was also very noisy. It did not encourage a kind of intimate relationship with the natural world. You were riding your horse as quickly as you could to try to catch up with the noisy dogs. Now, please contrast with those two forms of hunting the following form, something that Russians call ruzhenaya охота, usually called in English shooting. Now, this is an extremely different form of hunting. It had been around for a while, as far back as maybe the late 17th century, but was quite rare. Into the 18th century, it was really chiefly, if not only, undertaken by peasant huntsmen. So the peasants who were responsible for training and keeping the kennels of their master's dogs in their time off would take a shotgun and would go out quietly with one dog trained to retrieve and detect birds out into the woods or the marshes, and sort of one by one pick off birds that they would see. This is a totally different interaction with the natural world. It's quiet, it's stealthy. It can be done alone. No one knows you're doing it until your shotgun goes off, and then of course you can hear it, but up until that point it's very quiet. It requires lots of knowledge of the habitats of these various birds that you're shooting. You are not going after wolves, you're not going after foxes, you are going after birds, sometimes hares, but 90% of the time people who were engaged in this form of hunting were going after various bird species. And there was a kind of hierarchy of prestige among these various closely related game birds. And so you also needed to get very good at differentiating them. All of this, I'm trying to tell you, meant that the hunter who was engaged in shooting was someone who came to know the natural world very closely, developed real expertise as a sort of amateur naturalist. Finally, this form of hunting is the form of hunting that Turgenev engaged in, and only this form. There is virtually no evidence that he ever engaged in coursing and hounding. He was interested in this form of sport. Here's another image of a sportsman who engaged in ruzhenaya охота, known as shooting, to give you a sense of what such a person is like. And you can contrast the representation of a hunter of this kind with those artistic representations in Kivshenka's paintings of hounding and coursing. Finally, and this is one of my favorite images, this is by the famous landscape artist Ivan Shishkin. It's called Landscape with Hunter. And this shows you the way hunters who engaged in ruzhenaya охота, shooting, which is what Turgenev himself engaged in and what he promoted all his life. This shows you the way that those hunters interacted with the landscape around them. They became part of the landscape, not depending on a bunch of slaves to chase up the animals that they were going to kill, but taking it into their own hands to be careful, quiet, and observant as they stalked the birds they wanted to kill. So these are really important distinctions as we come up against our first really famous work by Turgenev. This is the work that made his reputation. If you have not read any Turgenev and you're tuning in today, I would say this is the one that you should start with. It's wonderful. It's a cycle of 22 short stories that he wrote between 1846 and 1851. He gathered them together and published the cycle of 22 stories in 1852. And it's called Notes of a Hunter. The title is translated a lot of different ways. In Russian, it's Zapiski Охотника. So I'm giving you a very literal translation of the title. There's a wonderful Penguin edition of the entire cycle called Sketches from a Hunter's Album, translated by Richard Freeborn. So if you're interested in reading more, I would say try that one. So we can't separate these stories that Turgenev wrote from the problem of serfdom. I mean, ostensibly, these 22 stories are simply told by a narrator who is a hunter, a shooting hunter. So in other words, he was engaged in the kind of hunting that's quiet that I was telling you about a minute ago. And this hunter just wanders around the Russian countryside looking for new places to hunt. And this gives Turgenev a perfect opportunity to have this hunting narrator run into all sorts of different Russians. He runs into nobles, he runs into merchants, but most importantly, he runs into peasants. And this hunting narrator simply records what he sees in these 22 stories. What was revolutionary and important about this, I mean, there are many things that are wonderful about this cycle, but probably for our purposes now, and I'm not saying anything new here, Russian school children to this day learn this very early in school, is that these stories described and depicted peasants simply as human beings. They're not They're not necessarily good. They're not necessarily bad. They're not stupid. They're not necessarily smart. They are just people. And Turgenev's narrator depicts them as people with feelings, with aspirations. And he depicts the nobles as also running the gamut, but many of them are terribly cruel to their peasants. Therefore, this work, Notes of a Hunter, had in Russia an effect that was similar to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin on the abolition movement here in the United States. And Uncle Tom's Cabin actually came out at almost exactly the same time. So the two works are contemporaneous. I will simply, I'll venture an opinion here, which is that Turgenev's cycle of stories is artistically, in my humble opinion, on a much higher level than Stowe's novel. And I think you would really enjoy it if you decided to read some of these stories. Now, I want to give you a sense of what some of the stakes were intellectually and politically when Turgenev wrote this cycle. And here I'm going to quote Alexander Herzen, who's a fellow liberal, fellow Western-leaning liberal like Turgenev. And here's what Herzen had to say about Notes of a Hunter. In Notes of a Hunter, Turgenev had his own special hatred. He wasn't picking up crumbs from Gogol's table. He was hunting a different kind of game. The landowner, his wife, his entourage, his steward, and the village elder. Aristocratic Russia retreated to a supporting role, and its voice began to grow weak. Maybe like Tsar Nicholas I, it was embarrassed by the events of 1848, that is, the revolutions in Europe. But in order to remain popular in literature, it had to abandon urban life, take up a hunting rifle, and slaughter on the ground and on the wing the wildfowl of serfdom. So what I'm trying to show you here is that Herzen conceived of this cycle of stories. And by the way, Herzen and Turgenev were very close in the late 1840s and exchanged all sorts of ideas about politics, democracy, as well as the natural world. Herzen sees Turgenev's stories, which are about a guy who's out hunting birds in the forest and comes across various nobles and various peasants, but he sees the work itself as constituting a form of hunting. It is a metaphor. It's a metaphorical hunting down and killing of the horrible institution of serfdom in Russia. And one more thing that I'd like to point out about this institution, and we'll wrap up in about 5-10 minutes here. So we're coming to the end of what I wanted to talk about with you today, and I look forward to questions. One of the things I argue in my own work on Turgenev is that Notes of a Hunter depicts not just a natural landscape, but a landscape of human residue that there's a very good Russian word for, and that word is praizvol. And praizvol is a Russian term that means when it refers to the phenomenon of one person imposing that person's will on this other person. So in other words, I get you to do what I want you to do, not what you want to do, just because I'm powerful enough to make you. So it's sort of capricious exercise of my power over another person. This is called praizvol in Russian. There are dozens of examples of it in Notes of a Hunter. And Herzen, when he was writing in the 1860s, in the 1840s, end of the 1840s, at precisely the time that Turgenev's Notes of a Hunter stories were coming out, he offers a beautiful kind of statement on the difference between turmoil in nature and human-created turmoil, which is polluted and contaminated by this disgusting, cruel human addiction to praizvol. Herzen writes, the wolf devours the lamb because it is hungry and because the lamb is weaker. But the wolf does not demand slavery from the lamb, nor does the lamb submit to him. So both Herzen and Turgenev agreed that serfdom was something that flew in the face of nature. It wasn't an example of the the strong victimizing the weak, because that does happen in the natural world. It was a case of the disgusting enslavement of the weak by the strong, which does not happen in nature, at least the way they saw it. Okay, so that's a look at some ugliness, and we haven't even really looked at the contents of the Notes of a Hunter stories. I did want to give you one example. One of the later stories in the cycle, which is one of the best ones, one of the most popular ones, is called The Singers, Pivtsi. And this is a story in which the hunting narrator goes to a tavern in a little village out in the middle of nowhere. And it's pretty dismal looking village and pretty ugly natural landscape there. But inside this tavern, something that's not ugly, something that's intensely beautiful is taking place. And the thing that's taking place is a singing contest among some of the local residents. So they're in this tavern and they are singing songs. And Turgenev, who was a tremendous connoisseur of music, this is a whole other story we could talk about. Turgenev's narrator describes the best of these singers. He's a young man named Yakov. And the description in this story called The Singers runs as follows. The narrator says, I confess that I had rarely heard such a voice as Yakov's. A truthful, burning Russian soul resounded and breathed within it and simply seized you by the heart, seized you by the Russian heartstrings. I recall once seeing in the evening, at the ebbing of the tide, on the flat sandy shore of a sea that was sternly and sorrowfully roaring in the distance, a large white gull. It stood motionless, offering its breast to the scarlet radiance of the sunset, and every now and then it slowly spread its long wings toward the familiar sea, toward the low crimson sun. I remembered that gull as I listened to Yakov. He sang, and from every sound of his voice wafted something familiar and boundlessly broad, as if our familiar step were opening up before you, stretching away into the endless distance. Now, that's just a tiny example of why readers have been celebrating for about 150 years now the skill of Turgenev's natural descriptions. It would take us an hour to unpack this description and describe what makes it work so well. But for now, I hope we can just sit back and enjoy it. So in conclusion, I just wanted to bring up the other work that you are likely or most likely to be familiar with. It's very commonly read in colleges. I teach it at Wellesley. And if there's a second work that you should read after Notes of a Hunter, then it should be this novel, which is Fathers and Children. The title used to be translated inaccurately as Fathers and Sons, but it's actually Fathers and Children. Отцы и дети. And here, we have some very interesting conflicts going on. The turmoil that is always present in Turgenev's view of his fictional world, the natural world, and of what's going on in Russia. So in this novel, very famously, there are some young, roughly college age men who have come home to their families in the countryside, and they have adopted a new ideology that they call nihilism, which is really just socialist materialism. They don't believe in anything that they can't measure with their five senses, and they want to destroy all the evil social institutions of Russia, serfdom among them, but all sorts of other things as well, burn everything to the ground, and then start from scratch. They believe in nothing, nihil in Latin, therefore it's called nihilism. And the chief representative of these nihilists is a famous character named Bazarov. And I just wanted to give you an example, and maybe we can end with this. An example of Bazarov speaking with one of the main representatives of the older generation of liberals who do believe in reform, but don't want to do it in such a radical way. And that man is Pavel Petrovich Kirsanov. So there's this little snippet of dialogue, and then maybe we can end with this. Bazarov is a medical student, and he's been out in the marsh gathering specimens that he's going to do some experiments on. And so he bumps into Pavel Petrovich, this disdainful older liberal who is, the generation of the fathers. And Pavel Petrovich sort of looks down his nose at Bazarov and says, "What's that you have?" as Bazarov comes out of the marsh. Leeches. And Bazarov responds, no, frogs. Oh, do you eat them or breed them? And he says, they're for experiments, said Bazarov indifferently, and went into the house. So notice that Bazarov is being indifferent, which is that cardinal feature of nature herself that Turgenev constantly comments on. But what's most important here is that this seems like a sort of throwaway piece of dialogue, but because Turgenev is such a fine amateur naturalist and has steeped himself in the natural world for so many years, so carefully, he has this dialogue represent two totally different worldviews. Pavel Petrovich thinks that this young biologist has gone to collect leeches because in Pavel Petrovich's generation, that's what doctors did. They would take these parasites, they would put them on your skin. The parasites would suck blood out of you that would allegedly remove toxins or other harmful substances, and that would heal you. So you sort of trick the parasite into becoming something that's in a symbiotic relationship with a human being, doing a favor to the human being. But that's not what Bazarov is doing. As a member of the younger, destructive generation, he is gathering frogs, which are a much more advanced form of life, much more analogous to the anatomy of a human being. And Bazarov is not going to do anything remotely like what was done traditionally with leeches. Instead, he's going to take this frog, he's going to pin it to a vivisection table, and he is going to cut it open alive and observe its interior anatomy so that he can become more expert treating human beings who have an analogous anatomy when he becomes a doctor. So when you think about it, these two medical approaches to specimen gathering are totally different. And in Bazarov's case, the case of the destructive young socialist materialist, the specimen is going to die in agony, a very useful agony, apparently, because by the end of it, Bazarov will understand anatomy better. But he destroys the creature rather than using it and tricking it the way in a way that resembled what was undertaken by doctors of, say, Pavel Petrovich's generation in the 1840s. There's a lot more to say about this. This is a tiny example, but I think probably what I should do is stop there and stop talking and give you a chance to ask some questions that I'd be more than happy to respond to. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, Tom. I'm sure that we all agree that this insightful lecture was all too brief, and getting a real feel for Turgenev's work would require at least a semester-long course in college. But I do hope that this lecture will interest all of us in doing some summer reading, whether it's Turgenev's original work, or if it's Professor Hodge's books that analyze Turgenev's literature. So now let's dive right into the Q&A section, and we'll start off with the first question from Thomas, who asks, did Turgenev personify nature with a capital N as much as his commentators do?
No, he didn't. It's possible that every once in a while he used the word he uses in Russian is priroda, which is the main Russian word that means nature. And he did not use a capital that I can recall, except there may be some exceptions there every once in a while. Instead, I mean, he didn't have to, in a sense, because quite frequently he referred to nature as a person, usually in the form of a goddess. I mean, this was not totally unusual in those days among the Romantics, who sort of deified nature as a godlike being. But no, he kept the lowercase p most of the time. I mean, obviously, in the title of his famous poem in prose called Priroda, Nature, it's a capital P, but that's because it's a title. And I see there's a second question. I'm just noticing that Thomas also had a question about Darwin, which is a great question. And I'll just quickly answer that one, which is that yes, Turgenev had read Darwin. He mentions him a couple of times, but I have found no evidence of his ever writing in any of his letters, in any of his essays, in any of his stories about Darwin, other than just briefly mentioning him in passing. So Turgenev was very well aware of what Darwin had been up to in the middle of the 19th century.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Douglas, and he has two different questions. The first one is, could Turgenev be considered an early environmentalist in the Russian setting? And the second question is, how did the Bolsheviks view him? Pro because he was opposed to serfdom, or anti because of his class background?
Great question. Number one, absolutely. Early environmentalist, yes. He is not as outspoken about environmental problems as another writer, which I'll mention in a second, or whom I'll mention in a second. But he does mention in passing the way environmental degradation, pollution, etc., were resulting in fewer birds and animals around for hunters to be able to go out and kill. And to that extent, he was an environmentalist. So there are several places where he makes it very clear that he understands that relationship between habitat and scarcity of game. But the person who really deserves the credit in Russia for being the sort of main proto-environmentalist, kind of pioneer in what we might these days call environmentalism or conservationism, is a person who was mentioned in the introduction by Michael, and that is Sergei Timofeyevich Aksakov, which I can type into the I think chat. I don't know if everybody can see that, but Aksakov, who was an older contemporary of, well, not even a contemporary, he was the generation before Turgenev, and he was politically much more conservative than Turgenev. I mean, Sergei Aksakov was the father of, the patriarch of the most famous of all the Slavophiles, who are the sort of, the Russians who are more patriotic and believe that Russia should not be seeking its solutions in the West. Turgenev completely disagreed with him about that. But on one thing that they were on the same page, and that was on hunting and on their love for ruzhenaya охота, of shooting, that quiet form of shooting, sneaking around with a dog and a shotgun. Aksakov wrote 3 treatises on the natural world, Notes of an Orenburg province hunter, Notes on fishing, which I've translated, and then another one that has a long title because it's miscellaneous stories about sport. And in those works, which come out in the late 1840s and into the 1850s, Aksakov is expressing a great deal more proto-environmentalist sentiment than Turgenev really ever does. So if you're interested in the beginnings of the environmentalist movement in Russia, you can do no better than to seek out some translations of Aksakov and read those works. They are wonderful.
Thank you, Tom. I'm actually going to jump in with a question of my own, if you don't
Sure.
mind. And this is something that's, as I was listening to your lecture and as you're talking about Turgenev's sort of reverence and awe of nature and how much time he spent, isn't there a bit of cognitive dissonance with killing animals and then having this reverence for nature? But it seems to the non-hunters among us, it seems a bit of a contradiction there.
This is a great question, and it's a wonderful point. And it's one that Turgenev was keenly aware of. And his friend Aksakov, whom I just mentioned, who also was writing these treatises at the same time Turgenev was writing Notes of a Hunter, put it this way. He said, "We hunters have our own strange form of logic. The more we love an animal, the harder we try to kill it." So hunters recognized that there was this irrational, predatory spark inside of them. And I don't know who in the audience fishes or hunts. I mean, I don't hunt, I fish. And there's something irrational about my desire to catch and control. And I release my fish. I don't kill them unless, except very rarely. And I don't know why I do that. It's totally irrational. And of course, there were people who objected to hunting. It's the so-called blood sport. And it is absolutely true that on a sort of individual specimen level, as opposed to sort of species-wide level, when a hunter succeeds, the specimen fails. I mean, the hunter succeeds, that specimen dies. Now, arguments can be made that hunters help whole populations by culling the sick and the slow, et cetera, and that may be true. But Turgenev sort of didn't care about those arguments. He did it because he couldn't help it. And in general, the sort of humane impulse for asking the question you just asked, Michael, was not as widespread as it was in an agrarian society like Russia, because people were killing animals all the time. I mean, you had 90% of the population lives on farms where they're killing domesticated animals on a daily basis. So, okay, you go in the woods and kill a few more. What's the difference? But having said all that, I do need to add, and I talk about this in the book, and it's a complicated topic. Can't really do justice to it here. But toward the end of his life, there's more and more evidence Turgenev did start hearing and feeling the arguments that were being made against hunting because of its cruelty to the animals that were being killed. So in some of his fiction, you do see evidence that he's feeling real pangs of conscience about it in a few of the late stories. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is that Tolstoy, Turgenev's erstwhile friend and enemy, they had a very complicated relationship. They were roughly neighbors in the countryside. They'd known each other really all their lives. Tolstoy famously gave up hunting in the 1880s when he became a vegetarian and made many other changes in his spiritual life. He could no longer live with the hypocrisy that you're pointing out, the cognitive dissonance that you're pointing out, which said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to hunt, but I'm a civilized, gentle person, but I'm going to go out and shoot things and kill them." Tolstoy did give it up. Turgenev never did. Turgenev hunted until he was too sick to be able to hunt anymore in 1883.
Thank you. On the topic of hunting, we have another question from David regarding hunting. He was asking, were the three forms of hunting for edible food?
This is a great question. No, they were not. So the two older forms, coursing and hounding, were really very different in their orientation. With the exception of hares, Hares, which are very common in Russia, like rabbits, closely related to rabbits, you could not eat what you caught by coursing and hounding. So, which is foxes and wolves, mostly wolves. So what were you doing? Why would you do it? Well, you were exerting a protective influence on your estates, right? Because if you could go out and kill a fox and kill a wolf, you killed a potential predator of your own livestock. So what are you doing? You're defending your property and defending your livestock by eliminating potential predators. You're not gaining any direct sustenance from it. You're not eating. No one eats fox. With shooting, which was, as I said, originally a peasant pastime that they engaged in their off hours, with shooting is very different. It absolutely was to get food to put on the table. So peasants did it both to get food for their own table and also for the master's table. So if the master needed grouse to serve to guests on a noble estate, the head huntsman would be sent out with a shotgun to go kill as many grouse as possible and bring them back. But absolutely, it was the case that subsistence hunting depended on what we call ruzhena охота, the use of that shotgun to go out and shoot birds, which in fact are edible. So there was a big difference in that sense too.
Great. Thank you for that insight on hunting. And we're going to switch gears a little bit into serfdom right now. And Peter is asking, what was the importance of dead souls to Turgenev, Gogol's work, his concern about freedom? You mentioned Gogol and picking up the crumbs of Gogol. So what can you say about that relationship or Turgenev's view of Gogol's work?
Where to begin? Turgenev worshipped Gogol. He absolutely loved him. And in 1835, believe it or not, at the University of St. Petersburg, Turgenev was actually one of Gogol's university students when Gogol spent one academic year in the post of professor of history in St. Petersburg. And he would give these nonsensical lectures because Gogol didn't know anything about world history. But Turgenev saw him there and wrote a fascinating memoir about that. Turgenev idolized Gogol, loved his stories, his novel Dead Souls, which of course also points up the barbaric ridiculousness of human beings owning other human beings. So the kind of socially corrective aspects of what Gogol was doing embodied in tremendous literary artistry. Turgenev loved that. And Turgenev was not alone. I mean, Gogol was the most popular Russian writer, if we can call him a Russian writer. I mean, obviously he's Ukrainian, but he's writing in Russian. So he's the most popular Russian language writer of the 1840s. When Gogol died in 1852, Turgenev, who was living in St. Petersburg, was so moved to write an obituary notice for Gogol that he published one. He wrote one short obituary notice and sent it off to be published in a Moscow newspaper. Why would he do that? Well, because Turgenev knew that the authorities were so worried about Gogol's reputation and about people stirring up turmoil after Gogol's death that the St. Petersburg authorities had put a citywide ban on publishing any obituaries of Gogol. You weren't allowed to discuss Gogol in print right after his death. So Turgenev thought, okay, I can get away with this if I send it to Moscow to be published in Moscow, which didn't have a similar ban. Well, it backfired because the authorities were very upset with Turgenev for having written the socially corrective stories of Notes of a Hunter leading right up to 1852. So they used his publication of that encomium, that praise to Gogol, they used that as an excuse to arrest Turgenev, which they did, to imprison him for an entire month, the month of May 1852, for having published that allegedly. I mean, the official charge was publishing that illegal obituary, and then Turgenev was exiled for over a year and a half to his own country estate. That one that I showed you pictures of, Spasskaya Lutovinova. So all of that flowed allegedly from this Gogol obituary, which in fact, everyone, and Turgenev himself included, pretty much agrees that that was just a trumped up charge, that really the authorities were punishing Turgenev for having been so transparent about showing social ills in the stories of Notes of a Hunter. But the answer to the question is that he absolutely idolized Gogol.
Well, this is a great segue into the next question, which is, did Turgenev have any issues with censors when publishing his work, given his observations of aristocrats?
Oh, constantly. Absolutely true. Yeah. So the editions in which you read Turgenev today, in Russian or English translation, doesn't matter. You are reading editions that are very different from what was being put before the Russian reading public back when they came out in the middle of the 19th century. So yeah, the censors were all over Turgenev. They were all over everyone, but especially Turgenev. They knew he was a problem. And so, I'll give you just one example of the kind of thing that happens. I don't know if you remember that passage that I shared with you in which Turgenev is offering this philosophical view of nature in which each point within the natural world considers itself the center of the universe and victimizes all the points around it, using them as its food, et cetera, et cetera. That whole paragraph never appeared in the review in which it was placed. So in other words, the larger work of which that paragraph is a part appeared without that paragraph. And you might ask yourself, why? Well, the answer was there was a double censorship. It was not just political censorship, but also religious censorship. And so the Russian Orthodox Church was also carefully watching the manuscripts as they were being prepared for publication of all writers, not just Turgenev, to see if there were religiously dangerous things being floated as well. And sure enough, the censors thought that passage looked too much like pantheism, the heretical idea that God is everywhere. So Russian readers actually at the time never saw that philosophical precept of Turgenev's about the natural world, even though retrospectively, as we now look back, that's one of the most famous things he ever wrote about it, one of the most important, sophisticated things he ever said about nature. But people at the time never saw it.
That's fascinating. Elizabeth's question is, what was Turgenev's relationship with the Russian Tsar? And I imagine the government at that time when he was publishing his stories. So, and then the second question, maybe you could provide a little bit more context for all of us who are not as familiar with serfdom in Russia. Elizabeth is asking, what was the process like in the Russian Empire for selling and buying serfs? Were they bought and sold? Was there a bond for their service or legal contract?
Yeah. Boy, okay, a lot of great questions. So Turgenev's relationship with the head of the Russian state. In the early part of his career, so Notes of a Hunter, for example, his relations were terrible. The Tsar, from 1825 all the way to 1855, was someone who would make Trump seem like a liberal. So this was Nicholas I. He was a reactionary, deeply conservative, viciously conservative. His stated goal was to turn back the clock in Russia, not to progress, but to make things the way they used to be. And Turgenev detested him. All the liberals detested him. There were even lots of people on the conservative side of politics, like the Slavophiles, also didn't like a lot of what Nicholas I stood for. So during that period when Notes of a Hunter's coming out, terrible relations. Then Nicholas I dies in 1855. His son, Alexander II, the one who was assassinated later that Michael mentioned, comes to the throne. And Alexander II had received a much more enlightened, much more liberal, sort of almost like liberal arts private education, and he was still a conservative guy. I mean, come on, this was a czar, the emperor of Russia, but he was still, compared to his father, for sure, much more liberal, wanted to institute lots of reforms. That Tsar Alexander II, allegedly, according to Turgenev, to one of Turgenev's French friends who wrote memoirs saying this, Turgenev told that person that word had been sent by Alexander II to Turgenev that one of the reasons that he, Alexander II, had emancipated the serfs, one of the heavy influences on him had been his reading of Notes of a Hunter before he had assumed the throne. So that was one of the things that had contributed. Now, it's indirect evidence, but it's actually it's pretty solid evidence. This is a memoirist who didn't generally make stuff up. So there's a few answers about the relations between Turgenev and the Tsar. It's complicated, but that's a quick one. How were serfs treated? Until the abolition of serfdom in 1861, there were two basic ways you could be enserfed. One was called abrok. The other was called barshina. Barshina was the older traditional form of serfdom, which is basically slavery. It means that under that system, you had to do whatever the master told you to do whenever the master wanted you to do it. You just were at his beck and call at all times. Abrok is usually translated as quit rent. So in other words, it was sort of like being hired on under a form of contract. And abrok, this quit rent system, becomes more and more common as we get out of the early 1800s into the middle of the century, and more landowners, including Turgenev himself, when he inherited about 1,000, I think it is, serfs from his mother when his mother died in 1850, he immediately put them onto this quit rent system, which is really more like sharecropping. It's sort of like, okay, these are my tenants. They pay me rent. I'll determine that for every acre they have, they need to pay me 3 rubles a year or something like that. But apart from that, as long as they pay me this rent that I'm charging them, their time is their own. They can do whatever they want, right? I'm vastly oversimplifying, but those are the two basic systems, right? And then after emancipation, sort of all bets are off and there's chaos.
Well, thank you for addressing those two very quickly, but also very succinctly and very clearly. And I'm going to actually end our Q&A session and this wonderful webinar with returning to the second question of Douglas, which we never got to, which was how, chronologically speaking, we'll end with the communist period.
Right.
How did the Bolsheviks, how did the communists, how did the Soviets view Turgenev, and whether they were fans of his because of his anti-serf stance, or did they see him as a representative of the aristocratic class?
So great question. And I meant to answer that earlier. So the Soviet treatment of Turgenev has been largely positive, or was largely positive, precisely because he was so passionately abolitionist in his political orientation. Also because he believed in the modernizing of Russia's social institutions. He, like the other Westernizers, so-called the Zapadniki, believed that Russia was terribly backward and needed to emulate Western Europe more closely in order to improve the sort of misery of the people that he saw everywhere around him. Yes, they also saw that Turgenev was an aristocrat, and this was a strike against him, but he was seen as an aristocrat in the Soviet period who redeemed himself because he was socially progressive, let's put it that way, to use sort of modern terminology. So there is not the sort of big problem with him that you get in the Soviet period with a writer, for example, like Dostoevsky, who is a deeply committed Orthodox Christian writer. Obviously he struggles with his own faith, but there's a huge Christian element there, which was not okay in the Soviet period. And so the authorities struggled a lot more with what to do with somebody like Dostoevsky, who, by the way, hated Turgenev because Dostoevsky was such a pochvenik, someone who believed so much with his conservative outlook in the Russian soil and Russian patriotism that it drove him crazy that Turgenev was constantly following this opera singer around Europe and living in Western Europe. I mean, he just thought he was nuts. So Turgenev does pretty well in the Soviet period. There's some excellent scholarship, in fact, that gets done on Turgenev in the Soviet period. This set of the complete set of Turgenev's works with beautiful annotations on my shelf right over there is a product of it.
Wow. Well, we covered a lot of ground, Tom. Thank you so much for this deep-ish dive. I wish we had more time to look at Turgenev's work, and I'm sure that all of our attendees are inspired to pick up a tome of Turgenev and also your books as well. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.